Hi, welcome again to week 3, and in this video we're going to cover another big slug of material. Hopefully it's not as draining or as exhaustive as last week's, where we undertook trying to cover the fundamentals that were discussed in Genesis 1 through 3. Here in week 3, we correspond to what Bartholomew and Goheen call Act 3, plus their section on the intertestamental period. One of the strengths of the book is their coverage of the intertestamental period. Aside from biblical theology, the focus of the course, it also helps us as Christians and ministers to understand more about the New Testament setting of the Gospels and Jesus and the people, the groups that he encountered in there. So I do think that's one of the strengths of the book. And this video, of necessity, is much more of a summary, an overview of these sections of the Bible. If we just took from Genesis 4 through the end of the Old Testament, lengthwise or content-wise, we're probably talking 70% of the entire Bible. So there's no way we can spend hours and hours going through every element of how every book or every character, every story revealed a new aspect of progressive revelation and biblical theology. What we are going to do is focus on some of the key concepts and how they're developed. I mean, in this section, when we left off last week with the Garden of Eden and then the fall, well, then the next big events are the flood, Babel, then we've got Abraham and his descendants, we've got Exodus, the taking of the land, judges, kings, prophets, and in the middle of all that is also the wisdom literature. And I told you earlier what I like about our textbook, but one of the things I wish it did more in depth was to develop more the wisdom literature and how it helps us in progressive revelation. We know there are prophetic psalms, prophetic and helpful passages in the Psalms that help us going through a progressive revelation. The book doesn't cover that a lot, but we can use these same concepts. And I do encourage you to focus and take a lot of notes on your readings. They develop these concepts a lot more in depth than we can in a video, and I'm going to share some of my key notes, but there's no way we can cover it exhaustively. I mean, we would have to have a separate course to just talk about these chapters and how progressive revelation and the core concepts of biblical theology unfold throughout these chapters. And keep in mind, though, that the course purpose is not to develop this super matrix or spreadsheet of thoughts that we have to memorize and then quickly forget. That would be frustrating for you, and it could never be complete. But the course purpose is to develop these tools so that all of us can continually apply the concepts of biblical theology, so that when we're ministering on a topic relating to salvation, we can look at Old Testament, New Testament, and future events and get a better concept of it than just as we compared in the first week, just a systematic theology definition or description of salvation. So that's in keeping with the purpose of the course. We're trying to focus on developing the tools to do these things rather than being prescriptive and saying, oh, you have to learn fact 17 on page 19 or whatever it is. So some of the key concepts of biblical theology that we're going to briefly touch on and that our textbook develops a lot better are the concept of covenant, concept of kingdom, the concept of worship, and the presence of God and how that develops with progressive revelation. Salvation, we mentioned earlier, also judgment, and then eschatology, the future events. And keep in mind that eschatology for people in the New Testament had a different cultural or expectational framework than it does for us, because they couldn't foresee the events of the New Testament, and the New Testament really didn't unfold the way they thought the messianic prophecies were pointing. So eschatology for them is of necessity a progressive revelation. They took the information that they had and had their expectations, and we layer that with what Scripture later revealed to the church and to us. And through it all, it is the concept and process of progressive revelation. As we review, as we develop, as we go through the Old Testament, we're constantly getting a richer, deeper understanding. But I mean, admittedly, our understanding is still complete. It is still shaped by our biases, whether they were ingrained in us in our early studies in the faith, ingrained in us because of denominational beliefs or whatever it is. We may have personal biases, and some of our Western culture creeps into it. I mean, the textbook actually talks about how distasteful some of the actions of God are to our Western mind. We've lived through, in less than a century ago, the Holocaust, and the concept of some of the Old Testament annihilations of people are distasteful to us, but we have to recognize God's purpose in doing it, and that, as the textbook brought out, the people who were driven out or destroyed or whatever the situation were deserved it. It was a just punishment for their actions. So we have to keep that perspective and not let our Western perspective, our recent world history, or our own personal biases overly influence our expectations as we go through this. And the greatest safeguard to that, and I know that all of you would tell me the same thing, is us approaching this asking for the Holy Spirit's wisdom, leading, and guidance in this, so that we can not only understand it, but be able to apply it to others in our congregation or wherever we minister. So as I've mentioned the core areas of biblical theology, but we're going to take just a little bit of time for each of these. When we talk about covenant, the covenant of God, well, when we think about the promises of God in our context, it's very different from what one of the descendants of Abraham might have thought of as the covenant of God, because we go through the Edenic mandate, then we have the Noahic covenant after the flood, Abrahamic, Davidic, and then eventually the new covenant. So progressively, the scriptures, and especially all these chapters and books of the Bible that we're talking about right now, reveal new facets of these consistently through there. And a brief excursus, not a news flash, but one of the biggest things we can relate to the people that we're ministering with is the importance of these Old Testament foundational passages. We'll talk in a few minutes about the importance of the intertestamental period and how it helps us understand the context of when Jesus was speaking. Well, if we just focused on Matthew through Revelation, a Christian or a potential Christian is not going to get the full impact of who these people, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, and all these that Jesus was interacting with, the importance of those people and their frame of mind, which helps explain some of their actions and positions. Now, it doesn't always justify their actions and positions, but it helps us understand where they were coming from and what had shaped those things. So we talked about covenant briefly. Think also about the kingdom. I think in the original plan, God was to be the king, and the people would not need a physical, mortal king inserted in there. So the first time I think about kingdom is at Babel, and Babel, as the text brings out, means confused. It also means gateway. So the people that were building at Babel thought that they were building a gateway to reach heaven. It ended up that God confused their languages. So this is another con- cornerstone, is what I'm trying to say, cornerstone verse and concept in trying to understand this and the differentiation between Christianity and other religions. Babel exemplified man trying to reach, to build up to attain God. And God's purposes and the things that He's revealed to us are completely different from that. In complete contrast to every other religion, our God, the Creator, comes to us. He came to the garden. He came through successive, progressive revelation throughout the Old Testament. And in our day, in our lives, He comes to us and dwells within us in the Holy Spirit. That is completely just opposite any other religion in the world. So Babel, man's attempt to reach God, and Babel was kind of a city-state. It's the proto-kingdom as far as kingdom on earth, not a godly kingdom, but a kingdom on earth. But throughout the intent, God was intended to be the king. Then we had people like Moses, Joshua, and the judges who were administrators for God. They were not kings, but they helped the people understand what God the King wanted. Then, through the people's insistence, we experienced Saul, David, Solomon, which were a better start to the kingdom than later kings turned out to be. Saul, David, Solomon all had their faults, and Scripture is rich with the details about how they fell short. But still, they were the best examples of the kings. And then later, in the descendants or the later kings, there were still some bright spots where a king would try to return the people to God, but still that would only last a generation or maybe two, and then be displaced by the people seeking their own way and rejecting God and going away. Now we know that Jesus is our perfect king. So through progressive revelation, we're going through people trying to build a kingdom at Babel to God's intent that He be the king, and then the earthly kings, the inadequate kings, and then the perfect king coming in Jesus. Also, a huge one for us with Pentecostal heritage is the worship and presence of God. So in most of the Old Testament and even into the New Testament, the presence of God was defined by or limited to a place more than what we experience as the indwelling of the Spirit of God, the dwelling place of God in us. So in Eden, Adam and Eve were able to walk with God. Jacob and Moses later experienced an angel of the Lord at Peniel and with the burning bush. Then progressively, the people of Israel were able to experience God through the thunder, the voice on the mountain. Then the tabernacle was the traveling dwelling place of God that traveled with the Israelites for 40 years in the wilderness, and then continued on until the building of the temple. And the temple was the final earthly representation of the dwelling place of God. The temple, I think we mentioned it in the first week, but the temple became even corrupted because people began using it for profit, for political reasons. So it became even an imperfect temple by the Intertestamental period and the early New Testament. And then we know the indwelling of believers is the presence of God, and we are looking forward to the New Jerusalem, where we dwell again in God's presence in a different creation, a different context from what we're even able to experience now. So with the concept of salvation and progressive revelation, the early characters in the Bible saw literal salvation. They saw deliverance through Noah and the ark. They saw deliverance from Egypt with the Exodus. They later sought salvation through compliance with the law, and all these are predecessors to New Testament grace and salvation. So I think it would have been very difficult for somebody in that mindset, and it was difficult for somebody in the Pharisaical or the Sadducees mindset to accept grace and salvation that is not law or works based. And we know Jesus did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law, a better completion, and using our key term, a progressive revelation of what the law really is. But the importance of the law for the Jewish people really can't be overemphasized. And when we get to the intertestamental period, it is actually what drives some of the actions of the different groups that we experience going into the New Testament. Is they are driven by a desire to comply with the law, not because they want to be legalistic, but because that is the way they see to please God. And again, it turns out they're not getting the full picture, they're short-sighted, but they are at least sincere and deliberate. And again, some people take it to extremes and begin using it for profit or whatever their self-serving ends are, whether it's power within the government or the highest seat of authority in the synagogues. So people began abusing that. And also another recurring theme through biblical theology is judgment. God's judgment. We mentioned earlier that the Western mind can read the Old Testament, and this is actually an impediment to faith for a lot of the people that we encounter or we witness to, because they say, how could a God so cruel in the Old Testament become a God so loving in the New Testament? Well, the important thing to remember for us is God's judgment is just and it is warranted. And whenever the people experience God's judgment, it leads to a separation from God. That is true of current judgment. A non-believer dies, they are separated from God. In the end times, the New Jerusalem, the New Kingdom, separation from God is the judgment that people are subjected to. And in the progressive revelation, you got to think that people had seen how with the flood, everybody but Noah and his family was definitely separated from God. But think also about the conflicts, even in the rest of Genesis, in Abraham's family, with brother-to-brother conflict, or brother-to-uncle conflict, and all these things that led to separation from God because of conflict with other people. Judgment also led to the extra 40 years in the wilderness, as the first generation that had left Egypt was punished by having 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, so that all that generation died, and only Joshua and Caleb were the ones who were allowed, the faithful spies, to enter the promised land. As we get into especially the kingdom period, there are repeated cycles of disobedience and separation. Disobedience from the people can lead to separation from Jerusalem, separation from the temple, separation from each other as they're dispersed in exile, but it's always also a separation from God. The recurring cycle that we see after judgment is after some period of time, they began to turn back to God, to repent, to ask for God's forgiveness. God will raise up a leader, restore them, return them, rebuild the temple, whatever the time calls for. But consistently, even after that happens, there's a subsequent falling away and additional separation from God. With eschatology, the interpretation of future events and end times. So the prophets in the Old Testament discussed future events. The wisdom literature discussed future events. But what was very unclear were the timelines and the expectations. And I really like that Bartholomew and Goheen mentioned that the people, especially in the intertestamental period, as they were thinking of their messianic or eschatological, difficult word for me to say, eschatological expectations, that they overlooked or missed or misunderstood the concept of the suffering servant that Isaiah brought out. So it helps set the stage for why they were dumbfounded when someone calling himself the Messiah was crucified. That just did not fit their eschatology or their expectations. And then I mentioned earlier, one of the things I enjoy about this specific textbook is their focus on the intertestamental period. And I want to spend the rest of the video talking about this. So for 400 years, from the close of the Old Testament canon until we pick back up with the Gospels, there is, in essence, a silence from God. Now, there are exceptions to this, because we know that we had Simeon who was hearing from God through the Spirit, so there are individual exceptions. But as a nation, they are not hearing from God. And so this gives them 400 years to try to understand better what all the prophecies, the prophets, the law had said, and put it in their current context. So keep in mind, though, that this was not the old Israel where David had been king, or where Solomon was king, and they controlled most of the commerce and the economy around them. They're very powerful. In this setting, in the intertestamental period, they were occupied or conquered, ruled over for 3/4 of this time, for 300 of the 400 years. And these oppressors, these occupiers, were definitely pagan, and often were also cruel and dominating oppressors, not just cruel in the laws and the slavery or the task that they made them do, but cruel in their taxation, or cruel in not allowing them to access what they needed to worship. So this is the period where the role of the synagogue really developed. And if we take just a strictly New Testament perspective, it's sometimes compared to, well, the synagogue is like the local church. But that's an oversimplification, because for these Jewish people, the synagogue, whether they are people living in Israel under foreign domination, or they're in the diaspora, Jewish communities living out in the rest of the world, the synagogue was their hub, their really the pivot point of their lives. It's where their education, their worship, their judicial system carried out, their social events were centered around the synagogue. And it's an interesting thing, because the judicial things related to the Jewish law were carried out through the synagogue, and then through appeal through the high priest. But in the local synagogue, the Jewish law was enforced. So as we think about, even with Pilate, the Romans were content to let the Jewish people have their own religious rituals, religious festivals, religious laws, as long as they did not conflict with the Roman law. So the they basically let the Jewish law operate fairly well in autonomy, and the synagogue was the place in the local community where all that happened. And notably, it was the place of education. So if you're in the diaspora in a Greek city, then you want your children to learn the Jewish ways. Well, that was primarily through your family and through the synagogue, because the local culture was not going to teach anything about the Jewish heritage or the Jewish culture. And then I want to give you the page numbers that I'm referencing here, but I know some of you have electronic textbooks or Kindle. So this is on page 96 through 98, and the section is called Israel's Faith. If you're using a Kindle version, it's the second bold-faced section in the interlude. And I can't even say in the Kindle version it's page number XYZ, because as you know, in an ebook or Kindle, if you change the type size, the font size, it changes all the page numbering. So if you go to the Intertestamental period section, Israel's Faith is the second bold-faced section in the interlude. The essential elements, 5 essential elements they bring out that define Israeli Jewish culture and life during this time. Some of them are no surprise. Monotheism, one God, the creator and ruler of the earth. Election, which is at this point a very incomplete concept, but God chose Israel. But sometimes the Jewish people would forget that God chose Israel, but there was also a second part of that, because through Israel, all people of the earth would be blessed. So just a small sidelight, but remember, throughout all the events of the Old Testament, God worked particularly with the Jewish people, but he was working with the end goal of bringing salvation to all the earth. So the Jewish people had focused on the fact that they were the elect, but sometimes they forgot the purpose of that election was to bring blessing to all the earth. Then, very importantly, the third aspect that the authors bring out, the Torah, the law. It absolutely separated the Jewish people from the Gentiles. The Gentiles saw no purpose in the dietary restrictions, in the Sabbath, in how you dwell with other people, and what you do with the foreigner in your gates, and all these things that were outlined in the Torah. The Torah was one of the distinctions that made them uniquely Jewish. And whether it was through dietary laws or circumcision or whatever else they had, they were zealous to protect that. And that's another reason the synagogue became such an important hub for the Jewish culture, is because that's where they discussed it, that's where they learned about it, that's where they reinforced each other. The fourth thing that the authors bring out is the land, the importance of the actual physical location of Jerusalem and of Israel. This is the land that had been promised to them by covenant. So it's not a temporary promise, it's a covenant. We see it now from 1948 on, the Jewish people reestablished in the land of Israel and being gathered back, coming from all over the earth to resettle in Israel. And we did not witness the initial changes, but in the first 30 or 40 years of Israel, especially because it was right after World War II, Jewish people were displaced again. You know, they'd been displaced from Germany, France, Austria, all over the world. They had no homeland. They didn't feel like they were welcome to go back to Germany or wherever. They came to Israel, and it was literally the bringing back together of the diaspora. There is still a diaspora. There are a lot of Jewish people who are not located in Israel, but it was a huge pivot point in history when in 1948 the Jewish nation was reestablished. And another, I have sidelights to bring up as I'm walking through these notes. We constantly hear the term Palestine today, and I want to go back to the time of Samson and David. They were in conflict with the Philistines. The Philistines, the historical enemy of God's people, are the Palestinians today. It's how we've changed or just translated, morphed that same word, Philistine, to Palestine or Palestinian. So that's, again, just a sidelight, but Philistines were the historical enemy of God's people, and today we still see the Palestinians as being the enemy of God's people and causing conflict in Israel, not limited to Israel. And then besides the land, the fifth element of the uniquely Jewish identity during the intertestamental period was the hope for future redemption. All right, that is a key point because that is what the groups that we're about to break down focused on as they thought about who or what the Messiah would be. It's also why the actual Messiah, our Lord, crushed their expectations, and many of them could not recognize or accept him as Messiah because he did not fit their expectations. And I would say that after the 60 years of being a Christian, our God frequently does not meet our expectations in the way we expect. Usually, he does it in a way we couldn't anticipate and in a way that is so much deeper and richer than we could have expected. And compare that, for the 19th time here, I'm on an excursus here, but compare that to the Jewish people's expectations of a Messiah as a military or a political deliverer, and how much more Christ brought than just a political victory or a political rescue. So again, a foreshadowing and progressive revelation. But remember that as we finished the Old Testament, the Jewish nation, Israel, had not only been divided in centuries past, it had now been conquered by the Persians. Some Jewish people were allowed to return to rebuild the walls, to rebuild the temple, but the Persians were the outside force that were controlling the Jewish nation or the Jewish territory. They were actually one of the better occupiers in retrospect. When the Greeks came, one of their primary themes, not just in Israel but throughout the world, any territory they conquered, they wanted to Hellenize it, make it like them, give them the Greek culture, the Greek law, the Greek way of life. So that became an immediate conflict because the Hellenistic thought conflicted with the Jewish thought and the Jewish laws. So then after the Greeks had occupied Israel or dominated Israel, an interesting 100 years. You've heard probably of the Hasmonean dynasty. The early Maccabean leaders led the revolt against the Hellenists, and it returned Israel to a type of self-rule for about 100 years. And then in AD 63, the curtain closed on the Hasmonean dynasty because the Romans showed up. The Romans were the most oppressive, the most restrictive, and usually the cruelest of the nations that had conquered Israel. Romans were obviously still in control at the time Christ was born, through Christ's ministry, and certainly at his death, but also for probably another 400 years after Christ's death. The Romans were the conquering force over Israel, and after the Romans came other conquerors, but we're trying to focus specifically on the intertestamental period. So in their circumstances, the Jewish people, the Israelites, were fixated on the Messiah. In their circumstances, it's hard to do otherwise. You're under extreme oppression. Your nationhood has been taken away. Your rights are subjected to the laws of whatever kingdom is currently ruling you. So it's hard for them not to expect a kingly Messiah. And think of the heroes of their past. They'd had Moses, David, Solomon, all that got great powers and victories over other forces. So it is probably natural for them to expect a kingly Messiah. And then within Israel, within the Jewish community, especially at the time of Christ, but in the 200 years leading up to that, there were some distinct groups that developed. And this is where I was saying earlier that understanding these groups gives us more context when we encounter them in the New Testament, because we try to say the difference between Pharisees and Sadducees and the scribes and all these groups, but if we understand a little bit about them as they developed during the intertestamental period in the centuries right before Christ, it gives us a deeper understanding of why they existed and their viewpoints and why they reacted the way they did when they encountered Jesus, who was not at all the Messiah that they were expecting. So first, the Pharisees. Pharisees were completely fixated on the law, on compliance. As a result of compliance, they extrapolated that and made it more extreme into legalistic compliance, but their intent was not just to demonstrate that they could keep all these laws. They're reacting against the Hellenistic culture that other people have tried to impose on them, or the Roman culture that people have tried to impose on them. They think that the way they can maintain their Jewish identity is by exacting compliance with the Torah, with the law, and this is part of the reason they had stumbling blocks when they heard Jesus, because they thought that Jesus was negating the law. Jesus said he didn't come to abolish or negate the law, but to fulfill the law. They didn't see it that way. They were set on their compliance as being the way to live until the political kingly Messiah returned, and they could not recognize Jesus as that. Now, there are exceptions. There are a couple of Pharisees that are brought out in the New Testament that are especially important, and they were able to see beyond the legalism. Some of them a little reluctantly. They may come at night. They may act after Jesus has died rather than during Jesus' lifetime, but they did come to faith in Jesus, from what we can detect from the scriptures. Another group similar to the Pharisees, but even a little bit more extreme, is the Essenes. They took the legalistic view of compliance with the law so far that to separate from the conquering cultures, they wanted to isolate. And you've heard about the community at Qumran, where they basically just separated completely and became almost an island within the territory of the country of Israel. And then the Sadducees and the priests are another major group. So together, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the priests made up the Sanhedrin, which is an important group in the New Testament. But the Sadducees were comfortable with some of the Hellenization or the Romanization later, because it allowed them to have positions of power. So basically, if they accommodated somewhat the Roman authorities, the Greek authorities, whatever culture was currently dominating them, they were allowed to have positions of power. And we know that Rome did not directly control every aspect of Jewish life. The Sadducees, the Sanhedrin, had a lot of authority and control within the Jewish community, especially regarding the Jewish laws. So they were a little bit more okay with Hellenism because it let them have their positions of authority, and usually that meant a little more prestige and a little more comfortable living. And another group brought up in the New Testament briefly are the Zealots. The Zealots kind of cross sections with these other groups, but the Zealots were at the point they were ready to take military force to revolt against whoever the ruling power was. And you remember that the Zealots even impacted, in Jesus' time, one of the apostles was Simon the Zealot. So Simon, in my mind, Simon had to be toned down a little bit with his expectations to accept Jesus as the Messiah that he was versus the Messiah that the Zealots had come to condition him to expect. And then these groups are, this is a gross parallel, but you could think of them as being the Congress, the House of Representatives, the Parliament, however we want to put it in a Western framework. These were the people who had authority, but they were not the bulk of the people. The bulk of the people were the common Jewish people. They definitely looked forward to the Messiah, but most of them were too preoccupied with daily living, with working 14 hours a day to feed their family, with raising their kids, with taking care of their parents, to do much more. They would go to synagogue, they would pray and rejoice with expectation that the Lord was coming, but they were not in positions of authority. They were not the Pharisees, they were not the scribes, they were not the Sadducees. They were the bulk of the people. So those are really, as we close out a very quick overview of the intertestamental period, these are a synopsis of the people, or the types of people, that Jesus encounters as he goes throughout his ministry. And we know that most of the people who responded to Jesus were the common people, the everyday Jewish people, and sometimes even everyday Samaritan people. So this, again, as we started this video, we said there's no way, and we're only at less than 45 minutes right now, but we could go for 6 or 8 hours and not cover every way all of these books of the Old Testament bring through progressive revelation in every element of biblical theology. But again, we need to see the tools, we need to see the methods, so that we can do these approaches and use these approaches as we prepare sermons, as we try to minister to other people, and as we try to field people's questions about, why was this important? Why did the Pharisees think they were going to get a messianic king that was going to come in and overthrow the Romans? Or whatever the situation is, we can get a better understanding. So I know that the pace of the course is fairly demanding. I'm trying to pace it a little bit better so that you're not overwhelmed with what we're asking you to do. But you can see already the scope, the depth, and the breadth of what this course covers. There's not many ways to cover it that are not time intensive, but please pray for continued wisdom and perseverance as we go through this course. To me, it is one of the most enriching courses, certainly that I've taught, but also the material is some of the most enriching in my ministry, and I think it will become in your ministry as well. So let's continue to pray and work forward to this, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and your feedback on what we're discussing. Thanks.